Hey y'all, it's entry number 94 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Adam Thielen, wide receiver, Minnesota Vikings. We'll start with the positives with Adam Thielen's fantasy profile. Touchdown threat. Thielen has been one of the best wide receivers in the NFL in the red zone over the last couple of seasons. During the 2020 season, Thielen saw 23 red zone targets, which tied for the fourth most in the NFL according to NFL Savant. He also had 14 receiving touchdowns, which was the third most in the NFL, only behind Davante Adams and Tyreek Hill. In 2021, he was similarly impressive, seeing 15 red zone targets and catching 15 touchdowns in 13 games. Being a red zone threat is great news for Thielen's fantasy upside in 2022. The next thing I really like about Adam Thielen's fantasy profile is the fact that the Vikings got some coaching upgrades on offense this offseason. The Minnesota Vikings will have a brand new coaching staff in 2022, led by their newest head coach, Kevin O'Connell. O'Connell has previously worked as an offensive coordinator in Washington and Los Angeles and has recently been a part of offenses that do a good job featuring and getting production out of their wide receiver room. This is great news if you plan on rostering Adam Thielen in 2022 because it means that there could be more opportunities this year for him. The last thing I really like about Adam Thielen's fantasy profile is the fact that he's got a reliable fantasy quarterback. In each of the last 7 years, Minnesota Vikings starting quarterback Kirk Cousins has thrown at least 25 touchdowns. In 6 of the last 7 years, he has had over 4,000 passing yards. Having a statistically solid quarterback will help Thielen put up decent fantasy numbers this year. Moving on to some of the concerns with Adam Thielen's fantasy profile. Mediocre usage and production outside of the red zone for a fantasy relevant wide receiver. While Adam Thielen has been a very solid fantasy wide receiver, it's worth noting that the past couple of years, his fantasy numbers are generally carried by the high receiving touchdown totals. Thielen hasn't gone for over 1,000 receiving yards since 2018 and has averaged 4.5 receptions on 6.61 targets for 54.45 receiving yards per game over the last 3 years, or 38 games according to Pro Football Reference. If for some reason his touchdown totals fall off a cliff, Thielen will free fall in the fantasy rankings and probably won't be worth rostering in your average fantasy leagues. The next thing that concerns me about Adam Thielen's fantasy profile this year is his age. Based on the typical wide receiver age cycle, Adam Thielen is towards the end of his prime at 32 years old. As fantasy football legend Mike Tagliere wrote in his At What Age Do Wide Receivers Decline article in 2021, wide receivers don't typically decline until age 33 or 34, but it is a little concerning that Thielen is so close to the age when wide receivers typically fall off, and this is likely his last season as a solid fantasy relevant wideout. The last concern I have with Adam Thielen's fantasy profile is that he doesn't get very many yards after the catch. This is a little pickier, but Adam Thielen had just 245 yards after the catch in 2021, the 39th best among wide receivers. This wasn't a fluke, as he had just 106 yards after the catch in 2019, the 87th best among wide receivers, and 195 yards after the catch in 2020, the 57th best among wide receivers according to Player Profiler. Some additional thoughts on Adam Thielen's fantasy profile. During the 2021 season, Adam Thielen finished as the WR27 in Standard with 132.8 total fantasy points and 10.2 fantasy points per game. The WR28 in half PPR formats with 166.3 total fantasy points and 12.8 fantasy points per game, and the WR28 in full PPR formats with 199.8 total fantasy points and 15.4 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. In half PPR formats, during the 2021 season, Adam Thielen had 1 out of 13 games with 0 to 4.9 fantasy points, 5 out of 13 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 2 out of 13 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 2 out of 13 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 2 out of 13 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points, and 1 out of 13 games with over 25 fantasy points according to fantasy data. Personal opinion. Adam Thielen is currently going off the board as WR31, about pick 80 overall on ESPN, and WR29, about pick 83 overall on Yahoo. I think he's going in approximately the right draft range here. I think Thielen will be fine in avoiding the age cliff this year based on Taglier's past research on the wide receiver age cliff, and the coaching change in general should be pretty beneficial for him. He doesn't have quite as much upside as some of the other receivers in this draft range, but he seems like a pretty good bet to be a low-end WR2 based on his recent fantasy points per game production. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. The Thielen Foundation was founded by Adam Thielen and his wife in 2018 to help serve, educate, and inspire those in need. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.